Thank you all very much for being here. I'm very honored to have been asked to present this afternoon, and particularly given that it's regarding the work of a designer who I followed for many years and who I greatly admire. As Jenny mentioned, we've ended up not working with Art being with me here up on the stage in conversation, but we're very fortunate that Art and his partner Suzanne are with us here in the audience. They're here at the front, and I'm going to do my best to do Art's life and work justice, and Art's there ready to correct me if I say anything wrong, I think. So whenever I give talks, I often like to come up with sort of subtitles for the talks, and I think if there was any subtitle for me, it would be instead of, or perhaps in addition to from Bauhaus to Bunny and beyond, I would also say this is all about art and design and Art Paul. I'll give you a brief introduction before I start getting into the work itself, and as well as my own minor story, which I'll get through quickly about how I came to meet Art. But as I give this quick introduction and biography of Art and his life and work, what I'm going to do, just so you know what you're seeing up on the screen here, is give you a pretty quick snapshot of Art's entire life through the medium of his own self-portraits that he has drawn over many years. And so that's what you'll be seeing as I just give this brief introduction here. So Art was born on the southwest side of Chicago, and he later moved to the Rogers Park neighborhood, where he attended the Roger C. Sullivan High School and met an art teacher who thought him gifted enough to earn a scholarship at the Art Institute of Chicago. Then World War II summoned him, and after a stint in the Army Air Corps, Art became aware of what was going on at the Institute of Design, as Laszlo Moholy-Nagy's new Bauhaus came to be called, and he chose to enroll in the ID. His work as an art director at Playboy, his own commercial design and illustration work post-Playboy, and his continuing art practice have all drawn acclaim, awards, and exhibitions. In 1980, Paul was elected a member of the Alliance Graphique Internationale. The Institute of Design, IIT, honored him with its Professional Achievement Award in 1983, and in 1986 he was elected to the Hall of Fame of the Art Directors Club. He received the Herb Liballon Lifetime Achievement Award from the Society of Publication Designers, and in 2008 was made a Fellow of the Chicago Chapter of the American Institute of Graphic Arts. The Society of Typographic Arts gave him a special award for outstanding achievement in trademark design for the Playboy rabbit head symbol, a lot of which we'll be seeing shortly. The Art Directors Club of Boston gave him an award for inspiring, encouraging, and creating an outstanding showcase for contemporary artists. The Art Directors of Philadelphia awarded him the Polycube Award for consistent excellence in communications. The City of Milan in Italy awarded Art with its gold medal for the exhibition Beyond Illustration, and the Art Direction magazine gave Paul the first award in its publishing history for interest and support of illustration and illustrators, and the tremendous range of illustrative styles that run in Playboy magazine. So that's only scratching the surface of all of the awards and recognitions that Art has received over the years. From my own point of view, what I see in Art's work is a number of themes, many of which you will see running as a thread throughout all of the work that we're going to see this afternoon. There are themes of experimentation, of investigation, of erasing boundaries, boundaries between fine art and popular culture, boundaries between art and design, the idea of bringing all of the arts together to create total works, and erasing boundaries between art, design, and everyday life. And there are three themes of freedom: freedom in his own work and freedom given to the others that he worked with. What you'll see in Art's work, and you'll see this as a direct trajectory that he took from his studies at the new Bauhaus at the Institute of Design, are radically simplified forms, rationality and functionality, and the idea that mass production, which is definitely what you could argue that Playboy was involved with, one of the largest circulations of a magazine in the 20th century, the idea that mass production is reconcilable with individual artistic spirit. Theo Crosby, the British architect and founding partner of Pentagram and the UK editor of Architectural Design magazine, described one of my favorite artists and designers, another one of my favorite art and designers, Edward Wright, as the only artist in England who has used communication as his theme. So in the same way that I kind of see art as one of these great 20th century hybrid practitioners, an artist and a designer, definitely not just a designer, and perhaps known around the world chiefly as an art director, but art, ultimately in probably his own description, would be emphatically an artist, and one who has had one of the most fundamental components of the world as his theme: us, people, humans. In particular, both the most visible yet intangible aspects of people, our faces, as obviously visible windows into souls, but also masks, and also our psyches, what goes on inside our heads. How each of these tangible and intangible aspects can somehow be made visible at once, yet remain inscrutable, or at least open to interpretation. And that last factor, the idea of being open to interpretation, is really a key attribute of art's work. Across his entire career, creating work that credits the reader with intelligence and leaves things ambiguous in a very calm, human, even generous way. So before I get really started, just having the pleasure of going through Art's work in the last few months and getting to talk a lot with Art and his wife Suzanne, I really became aware of this incredible cast of characters that you have coming to your mind as a list as you talk to Art and hear about all of the different activities he's been involved with, and of the cultural reach that Playboy in particular had, as well as the work of Art himself and the international reach that that body of work had. And so what I'm going to quickly do is just run through a list of some of these characters that we're going to encounter, and I'm going to play a Playboy jazz soundtrack to accompany it. But this will give you a rough idea of the kinds of people we're going to meet as we go through his work today. After that cast of characters, I'll give a very brief description of how I particularly came to meet Art myself, and a tiny little bit of background about myself. As Jenny mentioned, I'm a Chicago-based graphic designer, and as you can probably tell by my accent, very Chicago accent that I have. I run a small studio called Practice here with my wife and studio partner, Sean James. But the reason we first moved to Chicago was in 2010. I was invited to take on the role of the Director of Design and Publishing at the Museum of Contemporary Art here in Chicago. And one of the first things I did, one of the first things I do with any of my projects that I work on, particularly at the MCA, was to jump into the archive, into the history of the MCA, and to really see what they were doing in design and publishing right from the very beginning when they started in 1968. And they produced quite a wide number of radical catalogs and publications. They produced even vinyl records for some of their publications. But looking through one particular catalog, the White on White exhibition catalog from 1971, you can't even see the title there. It actually does say White on White. I can see it on my screen. But looking through the back, I was just curious. I'd been to one of the first board meetings at the MCA at the time. As a department director, I would go to the board meetings. So I was very curious, who's on the board of trustees in 1971 at the MCA? So I started scrolling through the list and had some industrialists and interesting people. Don Baum, we're going to come across him a little bit later in the talk. But looking a little bit further down, I was really interested. Oh my God, 1971, Hugh Hefner was on the board of the MCA. That was really interesting. I scanned a little bit further down the list. Let me see, what else did we have? Lou Manilow, who's actually still on the board, incredibly. Walter Netsch, my favorite Chicago brutalist architect. And even more interestingly to me than Hugh Hefner was, wow, they had Art Paul on the board of the MCA. And this was really interesting to me. I'd actually just at the time become a member of the Alliance Graphique Internationale, the international graphic design organization based in Switzerland that I mentioned earlier that art is a part of. And I got thinking, I realized that art was alive and working still here in Chicago. And I had my AGI, or RG as they call it, my RG address book, and realized that art lived just around the corner from the MCA in the John Hancock Center. So I decided I would write a postcard to Art and see if I might be able to somehow meet him. I wrote a short message saying I'm, at the MCA, and at least at the time I was at the MCA, and was very interested to see that he'd been on the board, and I was very curious to hear more stories about that. And went for a walk to get a stamp for the postcard and realized that, of course, the nearest post office to the MCA is in the basement of the John Hancock Center. So I thought, why not just go and drop off the card myself, which I did. Slid it under Art's door, and later on he discovered this mysterious card that had somehow been slipped under his door, and we ended up meeting. And so this is the pleasure I've had for the last 6 months or so. I left the MCA, I've been running my own studio since last year, and fortunately the Terra Foundation invited me to give this talk, and it was a perfect opportunity, perfect excuse for me to start doing what I was actually really wishing to do since I first wrote the postcard, which is to dive into Art's archive and look through his work and really go and visit his office and studio in his apartment and hear a lot more about what had gone on. So that's really been my excuse to incessantly bug Art and Suzanne for the past 6 months and visit them a lot and go through all of their work, and it's been a real joy. So just some snapshots of the studio, a lot of the heads drawings that you're going to see a bit later on, some of the many awards that I mentioned, and then a particular quote which I loved the minute I saw it. And I still don't fully understand exactly what Art means with form follows function. I'm going to have a bit of a guess, and he can correct me afterwards. But from what I saw, I mean, most of the work that I have seen of Art's and the work that he enabled through his art direction really was a lot to do with honesty and freedom. And so form follows frustration. I don't see a lot of frustration in Art's work, but what I gathered from this is that a lot of the work that Art has done and a lot of the work that he has enabled others to do has been a way of helping them to avoid frustration by giving them this freedom and allowing them to be themselves. So there are always, I think this is a classic thing for designers. I myself work like this as well. We all love constraints because we immediately work to find a way around those constraints and to get freedom out of that. So constraints really do give us frustration, but form comes out of that frustration when we manage to achieve freedom and to do what we really want to do. So I thought I love this note just sitting on top of one of his, I believe it was an honorary degree from University of Missouri. So let's get straight into Art's career, which really starts from his childhood. He's been drawing his entire life. You're going to see drawings from childhood right through to drawings that he's doing still today in this talk. And really, where Art starts, where I've often wondered, where did Art get his influences from? Which artists or designers? What was the particular work of Art, perhaps, in his life that he saw that really struck him, that gave him that epiphany that we all often have that inspires us to do what we end up doing? And for Art, it wasn't necessarily a famous artist or designer. He mentions Michelangelo and Norman Rockwell, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But for him, the big epiphany that Art still remembers very clearly is that of watching his brother work as an artist. His older brother, Norman Paul, and Art tells a particular story of watching his brother sit at the table while his sister had fallen asleep with her head resting against the table, and immediately sculpting a profile portrait out of clay of his sleeping sister. And I think from the way Art describes it, it was really at that point in time that he realized, wow, you know, this is something you can capture. You can really capture the character and the serenity of a person in their face, in their head, and imagine if that's something you could do for a living. And Art talks about it very powerfully, and he still has the very sculpture that his brother made sitting on one of his bookshelves in his apartment. And so it's a really powerful thing to see that even today, the way that he describes that story. Art used to always, as a child when his brother was older and working at the time, used to go to the L station on Morse Avenue and just observe all the characters exiting the turnstiles while he was waiting for his brother to come home from work. And I think this observation, this constant analysis and observation of faces and of characters and of people in a very empathetic and inquisitive way is something that you really do see through a lot of Art's work. As a child, where people detected that he had an interest in art, he found himself often being asked this pretty much classic, I think people still might ask this question of budding artists today, young children. He would be asked, well, if you're into art, are you going to go into fine art or are you going to go into commercial art? And Art's response was always, why not both? So the earliest drawings that Art showed me as we looked through a lot of his work were these incredible illustrations of famous works of literature, Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, for example. And he described reading modern library editions, these fairly affordable editions of literary classics that were coming out in the 30s and 40s. And the powerful thing about these books was that they had illustrations accompanying the texts. And I think Art was inspired by this and would start to draw his own illustrations in the end papers and in the side margins of the pages, realizing that he could very easily draw a similar level of quality of artworks that he was seeing printed in the very pages. So modern library editions like Of Mice and Men. He was also illustrating God's Little Acre, some of his favorite books at the time. And so you can see some of these drawings that he was producing at a very young age with remarkable graphic quality and skill. Some more drawings of Mice and Men. Already at this stage, quite a wide variety of styles that he was introducing to his mark making. An illustration from God's Little Acre. He also illustrated his edition of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Often getting quite stylized in the shapes and forms, very contemporary. I mean, even today this feels very contemporary. Incredible use of contrast and lightness and darkness. Illustrations of the Hunchback of Notre Dame. Always very fine control, even in looser crowd scenes, for example. Nice spirit and looseness, but still at the same time very much in control. So Art finished high school, expected to study at the Art Institute. He'd been attending Saturday classes at the School of the Art Institute from a young age, and showed such great skill of the kind that we obviously just saw in the drawings, and had, upon graduation from high school, already had a scholarship lined up to study at the School of the Art Institute. He went straight from graduation, I think across the same weekend, from graduating right into the Air Corps. This was during the Second World War. So he spent 3 or so years, 2.5 years to 3 years training in the Air Corps, but still at the same time always continuing with his artworks, drawing on any material with any materials that he could find to hand. You know, he's got a whole lot of incredible drawings, even just informal shapes and caricatures and mark making on. These are all on Service Club stationery from Lincoln, Nebraska. So even though Art had this aforementioned scholarship lined up for the School of the Art Institute, while he was in the Air Corps, he was aware of perhaps more interesting activities that were taking place at the Institute of Design, which had opened up in 1937, founded by Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, the Bauhaus master painter and photographer. As Art recalled, by the time I got out of the military, I realized that the ID, which Bauhaus master Laszlo Moholy-Nagy had founded after fleeing Germany in the 1930s, really was the place to be. He'd heard exciting things about the ID, the Chicago Bauhaus, about its busting out of traditional methods of teaching and its stress on experimentation, discovery, and unleashing oneself from the old habits and conventions. Multiyear had started the Bauhaus, the new Bauhaus as it was called, in 1937 on the invitation of the Chicago Association of Art and Industry. He was invited to start a new design school. He named it the new Bauhaus, and the philosophy of the school was basically unchanged from that of the original Bauhaus. Its first headquarters was the Prairie Avenue mansion that architect Richard Morris Hunt had designed for the department store magnate Marshall Field. We'll come across Marshall Field again a little bit later too. Due to financial problems, the school had briefly closed in 1938, but Walter Paschke, chairman of the Container Corporation of America, himself an incredible patron of 20th century avant-garde artists and designers, an early champion of industrial design too in America, soon offered his personal support, and in 1939, Multiyear had reopened the school as the Chicago School of Design. In 1944, this became the Institute of Design, and in 1949, it became part of the new Illinois Institute of Technology as we know it today, and also the first institution in the United States at that time to offer a PhD in design. So given that all of these incredible events were taking place, Art made the decision to skip the Art Institute and head straight for Institute of Design. As he put it, such excitement going on with the ID, it was so invigorating, even the theory behind it was invigorating. Am I going to go back to still lifes and just looking at Greek heads? So although Multiyar's work and influence was a key reason for Art to choose the ID, the professor actually passed away, sadly, a couple of months after Art had started training there. So he therefore never met Multiyear, but happily it turned out that many of the instructors at the Institute of Design who did teach Art were disciples of Multiyear. This is one of the books, or a particular book that Multiyear authored, an account of his efforts to bring and develop the curriculum of the School of Design called Vision in Motion. So just a few of Multiyar's works as a tiny primer to give you a sense of where this work was influencing other teachers and ultimately influencing Art in his practice too. Multiyar was famous for photograms, photographic work, photographic experimentation, as well as graphic design and typography. So what really appealed to Art, this is one of the joys of going through a whole lot of Art's work. It's incredible, the archive that he has and that Suzanne, his partner, is tirelessly pulling together and cataloging at the moment. Really, I mean, a lot of the work, when I think back to my own studies in London, which was only in the early 90s, I don't have nearly as much work from my time that Art has from his studies back in the late 40s at the ID. So this is one of the joys. You can flip over some of these works that I'm going to show you, and you still see Art's name on the back and his class number and the department that he was studying in. So as I mentioned, Art had heard exciting things about the ID, and about how they were busting out of traditional methods of teaching and the stress that they put on experimentation, discovery, and unleashing oneself from old habits and conventions. Again, themes that we're going to see again and again with Art's work. So just to show you through a few of the works that Art produced during his 4 years at the ID, a wide range of experimental media and approaches. There's a glue resin print that he made in 1948. Various photographic and airbrush works, tin plate prints, silk screens, very bold use of color and abstraction of faces. You'll see again and again the repetition of heads and faces in Art's work. Some more airbrush work. A lot of iterative work that took, for example, photograms and layered them. Abstract studies of human form. And a lot of extremely, still today, again, I'm going to keep saying this, a lot of what, I mean, most of Art's work is very contemporary, it still feels fresh. This was an experiment with Art using airbrush techniques over pages torn out of Life magazine. A lot of typographic pattern experiments going on as well. Some more studies of human form, and illustration work. And as you'll see here, compared with some of the work I'm going to show in a minute, Art was so technically accomplished and really wanting to take the Bauhaus ideal of just working as part of everyday life. He really already, as a student, started working commercially and transitioned very easily during his studies from a mere student to a commercial illustrator and designer. So you'll see some of these figures and artworks that he was doing at school and how they very easily were transitioning into his freelance work. So Art actually graduated in 1950 from the ID. And immediately set up his own office on 21 East Van Buren Street. And it's great to hear Art's descriptions of his studio. It was a small office right on the same level of the L tracks in Van Buren. He talks about how every time the train went past, the whole building would rattle and dust would fall on his artworks. He would have to cover things to protect the works. And you can see, just for me, one of the ideal and inspiring things to see is, often as a student, you almost half expect to do get all of your exciting experimental work out of the way, out of your system while you're at college, and ready to resign yourself for much more boring commercial work in order to earn a living when you leave school. And what's just so incredible with Art's work is that he just carried straight on, doing commercial work while he was a student, and then his work from his own office could very easily be the type of work made, some of the work that you just saw when he made it at the ID. So already working for pretty heavy-hitter clients, Marshall Fields. This is, 1952. Really quite radical graphic works for some of the most mainstream clients you can imagine. A bit torn up, but still completely fresh color-wise. This beautiful color palette advertisement for Marshall Fields. And interestingly, Art went straight into working on various levels of magazine design as well. Collegiate magazine. You can see Art's credit there in the body design. He wasn't yet at the level of art director. He didn't have full control over the totality of a magazine yet. But you can still see his experiments of form and the shape of the body that he was undertaking at the ID, now translating into editorial pages of Collegiate. And one significant commission for Art was the work, illustrations and spread designs for the American Medical Association publication Today's Health. And so Art was free to seamlessly continue these formal experimentations from the Institute of Design, and was already hinting at what was to come, not only in his own career, but just what was to come in general in mid-century design, illustration, typography, and art direction. So it's really interesting, you can see these rather experimental uses of typography, white space, blocks of color, working very easily within the constraints of the time of two-color printing. But what is particularly interesting or even jarring, perhaps, is all of these graphic experimentations were taking place within a very traditional magazine cover. So this is July 1953. Art was given license to do these experimental illustrations, but it was still exactly what you'd expect, early 50s magazine cover, a happy family, airbrushed, color corrected. And bearing in mind that this was July 1953, Art hadn't yet been able to take control of an entire magazine. It's therefore just extremely powerful to realize that from July 1953, we immediately went to the stark contrast of the very first issue of Playboy, which hit newsstands in December 1953. So just look at the comparison of the two types of covers. So use of white space. I think even if you had a magazine today on the newsstands with this use of white space, it would still be radical. So in late 1953, this is what changed everything. A Chicago copywriter from Esquire named Hugh Hefner walked into Art's office on Van Buren looking for an art director for the magazine he was developing, and he had learned of Art Paul through a mutual acquaintance. Hefner's intention was originally just to approach Art to commission a few illustrations, but he was immediately struck by all of the work on Art's studio walls and asked Art if all of this experimental material on the walls was Art's work, is this your work, or is this work that you like? And Art just replied, both. A lot of Art's own work on the walls happened to be for projects that clients had rejected either for being too flamboyant or too hip for the tastes at the time. But for Hefner, this was exactly what he was looking for. Someone who could do that work, but also knew that work in order to commission other people to do it as well. The perfect definition of an art director. And so this brings us into obviously a major phase. By no means for me at least, the work that I now know of Art from having looked through all of his work, by no means the definitive age of Art's work, but really a huge impact on American culture, on Art himself, and on the field of art direction and illustration as a whole. So this is Hef, 1953, at his kitchen table, putting together the first issue. Hugh Hefner worked on it in his kitchen table. Art ultimately, despite reservations, decided, okay, I'm going to take this on. Was working on the magazine from his studio. Reason for some of the reservations was, at the time, Hefner planned to call the magazine Stag Party. The initial dummy, which was designed by a cartoonist and resembled kind of movie star and screen magazines of the time, nothing completely radical. Hefner knew that he wanted something different, more innovative and sophisticated, but he didn't quite know how to get that. So together with Art Paul, he now had his man, and they worked on creating the very first issue. Art himself recalls, Hef was very insistent on this Stag Party as a name. I told him it was madness. There was already an outdoor magazine at the time called Stag, so ultimately I believe they received a cease and desist to not call the magazine Stag Party, so it was fortuitous. And they were therefore tasked of thinking of alternative titles. And the animal theme kind of stuck with it. They got rid of Stag, came up with Playboy, which was ultimately coined by Eldon Sellers, one of Hefner's founding associates, who went on to become a company executive of Playboy. And having decided on the word Playboy, it took about 1 hour for Art to sketch the famous rabbit profile with the cock deer and the tuxedo tie, which we're going to see in a minute. Art intended originally for the symbol to be used as a characteristic endpoint to the articles, but those plans changed, and the rabbit head instead became Playboy's corporate visual identity and a running theme for the issue's covers. Before I take you through a whole very quick whistle-stop tour of all of those incredible covers, not all of them, that would take us for the rest of the evening, but a number of them. I just thought again, I really want to highlight the radicality of this very first issue and the subsequent issues of Playboy. This is a newsstand, not in Chicago, but in New York. It's very difficult to find a Chicago newsstand photograph from 1953. But this is 1953, American newsstand, and this is what you would find usually. August 53, Saturday Evening Post. Significant to look at Saturday Evening Post because Art himself, as a child, had mentioned kind of Michelangelo and Norman Rockwell as the two poles of inspirational artists for himself. And the way that Art describes it, Norman Rockwell's covers for the Saturday Evening Post were something that very early on in his childhood drew his attention to the idea of commercial art, its power to define contemporary everyday life, and a way of getting closer to things that people relate to. And referring back to that false dichotomy that I mentioned earlier, the idea of, as a child, do you want to go into fine art or commercial art? Can't be both, which one? Pick one of the two. And Art's feelings at the time were, as he described it, well, I like Michelangelo, but he didn't seem to have such an easy time of it, being told what to do. He was essentially painting religious themes to order because the church was the client for Michelangelo. Whereas artists like Rockwell, doing these amazing covers for national magazines, seem to be having much more fun and are able to get much closer to the action. And this sense of a more personal embedding of the artist in the action really appealed to Art, and really what I would classify almost as a Bauhaus kind of art as life philosophy. So just continuing some of the other covers you might encounter on a newsstand in 1953, the Pope on the cover of Time magazine, Esquire. The art direction of Esquire by Henry Wolfe at the time was very much comparable to the radicality of what Art was doing, still in a kind of different, perhaps more graphically controlled, less spirited and loose and lively aesthetic, but definitely an influential and equally inspirational, I think. Vice President by the name of Nixon on the cover of December issue of Life. New Yorker cover. Vanity Fair, December 1953. National Geographic, 1953, with their eye-catching covers at the time. And then again, back to Playboy. I mean, it's really quite remarkable. This particular minimalism that art had on the cover was, obviously very much a deliberate direction he wanted to head in, but at the same time, a kind of, again, I think an embodiment of this form follows frustration philosophy of arts. Minimalism through production constraints. At the time, the printer they were using in downstate Illinois had, I think, a library of 8 typefaces from which art was allowed to work. The cover, you had a color palette of 2 colors, so art went with classic red and black. And overall, it was really this brand new mission that they were both on. They didn't have their names, neither of Art's or Hugh Hefner's names were on the masthead of the first issue. They really weren't sure if there was going to be a second issue. And for Hefner, Playboy was a mission to influence the mores, morals, and lifestyles of men in the mid-century of the 20th century. For art, it really became a laboratory that turned into a model of contemporary magazine design and illustration. I found this original photograph. This was the photograph that art was given. They had a very low shoestring budget, and so this was just a press photograph that Hugh Hefner had licensed for use on the cover. But rather than just use it wholesale with the crowds in the background of a Marilyn Monroe at a parade, you can see how he painted around it and ended up with this much more abstract cover with the graphic blocks here, kind of half illustrating confetti, a little bit kind of giving an idea of confetti or of a cityscape, abstract blocks. And again, really just such a radical gesture for a magazine of the time. The cover of Playboy's 3rd issue, which you can see here, they did survive. The first issue was a massive hit, and they immediately launched straight into the 2nd and 3rd issues. And it's here on the 3rd issue where you can see the iconic rabbit logo makes its first appearance, at least on the cover. It was appearing inside, which I'll show you shortly, right from the very first issue, just as a little punctuation at the end of articles. So again here, I mean, for people who just know of Playboy in terms of general knowledge in the contemporary cultural sphere today, the idea that this is a Playboy cover, I think, is really surprising and not what you would usually expect. But this was typical of the covers in the early stage of Art's career with Playboy. Right from the beginning, I would say that it's probably true that Art's interest in the magazine was really less about the nudes. The monthly Playmate shoots in particular really largely became Hefner's domain. And this really allowed Art to focus on pretty much everything else in the magazine, because there was a lot of other things in the magazine. The well-rounded and sophisticated lifestyle that Playboy's original goal aimed to embody. Social ideas and culture, art, politics, environment, literature, cars, fashion. Art really, likely spent as much time on fashion layouts as any other department in the magazine. But the covers were really where all of the components overlapped, where as art director, Art would establish an overall formal and conceptual theme for a given issue. So much like, again, I think there's a comparison to be made with Henry Wolfe's Esquire covers of the late 50s. Art's Playboy covers were not at all driven by, licentious half-nude women, as one might expect, perhaps from later years of Playboy, but really by witty ideas and visual puns, which included the trademark bunny in as many playful guises as possible, leading the readers on a chase to find the hidden rabbit on each new cover. So, I mean, here it's so abstract, the rabbit in this particular one. You're going to have to play Spot the Rabbit now as I quickly run through a whole ton of covers. The sun, in this particular case, is the rabbit here. But just before I get on to more of the covers, this really is one particular detail which I myself only discovered, I would say, a couple of months ago in looking through Art's work, and I think a lot of people really don't know about this. The front covers of Playboy are famous, but the back covers, and this is the back cover of this issue, the back covers for several years in the first couple of years run of the magazine didn't have ads, which in itself is really shocking for, I have art directed a magazine, a music magazine myself in London, and the idea of being given free license to take on the back cover, which is traditionally the greatest, the most valuable real estate for commercials, for advertising on a magazine, Art instead of having to run ads early on, just free license to experiment graphically. And I think it's here, particularly on the back covers, where you see these corresponding approaches from front to back. Front cover of July '54, back cover. Just incredible, really straight out of the Bauhaus, straight out of the Institute of Design, here on what would traditionally, with all of the other magazines, be the most expensive piece of advertising space of the magazine. So a number of covers. I'm going to just run through these really quickly because it's taking a lot of time already here. September '54, back cover. Again, really always thematically appropriate, but always surprising back covers. For this particular one, this is 1955 was the first time you actually came across an advertisement on the back cover. And so that started gradually to creep in. I think art and particularly I think Hugh Hefner was waiting for the right level of quality of advertising to make way for ads over art's experiments on the back covers. But they still continued. 55, more back covers, and so on. So what you see here as, let me see, what we see here just with this rabbit, this was another manifestation of the famous Playboy rabbit. Something, I guess, perhaps more in Hugh Hefner's vision of what he wanted, a true mascot rather than a more abstract motif, which is what Art's logo particularly came over the issues. And so the way that was evident in terms of Hefner comparing Playboy to and aspiring to other magazines at the time, he really wanted this mascot as a comparison to Eustace Tilley, perhaps from the New Yorker, or Esky from Esquire magazine. And so the parallel was the rabbit. But rather than use this overt symbol, this was one of the rare cases where Art did actually put the logo, the famous logo, on the cover. This was the first instance of a full feature appearance in 1956. Art, instead of going with direct repetition of this clear rabbit form, really kept playing with either in abstract detail, through pure minimalism. This particular cover, 57, I think, is the most extreme, perhaps most radical cover, pure white apart from deceptively innocent, conceptually charged cufflinks left on the table. And what Art would also do was integrate the Playboy covers with editorial pages inside the magazine. So the isolated life-size cufflinks on the cover were appropriately mirrored by a trompe-l'oeil fly sitting on the facing page of the first ever publication of George Langeland's famous work of fiction, The Fly. So I'm really going to skip through a whole lot of these covers now because I want to make sure we get to the rest of Art's work. Really incredible, this dictionary cover in particular, just some really surprising that a magazine of multi-million circulation numbers allowing such experimentation. And you can, again, playing Spot the Rabbit, And I think also worth noting as well is just the character in the women depicted on the cover at this point in time. They always seemed mostly in control. They were the ones playing with the reader in terms of, here, mischievously cutting a shape out of the cover. An example of just different typographic approaches as well that Art would use. This particular cover I passed over when I was going through the archive because I thought, okay, it's just a painting of a female figure here. But if you look at the bottom, it's a life-size photograph of an artist's easel with the paintbrushes at the base of the page. So just a few more. I think this is perhaps one of my favorite covers with the representation of the rabbit. Petals of the flower. The glove. Even going so far as to have knitwear made with the rabbit motif. And it carries on and on. So during this time, as Art was really growing as an art director, what is also important to continue to remember is that through all this time, he was continuing his own artistic practice. So in 1964, when the British cultural journal Motif ran a piece on art, the publication significantly focused on his drawings and not on his work at Playboy, even though it was at the height of the fame and the infamy of Playboy. Even more appropriately, the writer chosen to analyze art's work was the influential architecture and cultural critic Reyner Banham, who is, for myself, who I'm a particular fan of. Reyner Banham was a writer who followed and documented such mid-century British movements as the multidisciplinary independent group, whose groundbreaking 1956 exhibition, This Is Tomorrow, is considered by many to have been the birth of pop art. And he also followed the rise of the so-called new brutalist architects like Allison Peter Smithson and James Sterling, along with avant-gardists like Cedric Price and the Archigram group. So in this story, Banham highlights what is, to me, a key point in time for Chicago's evolution as a city that was somehow simultaneously a platform for the avant-garde and a shaper of popular culture. Banham notes in his introductory text, at the time of Chicago's evolution, he notes that the offices of Playboy at 232 East Ohio happened to be right next door to the offices of a certain Ludwig Mies van der Rohe at 230 East Ohio. The model shop of modernist architecture and, as Banham wryly puts it, the model shop of the increasingly notorious magazine. Banham describes this 60s Chicago of Mies and Playboy. Just play a quick clip of Hefner arriving in his Benz. And this is right next door to Mies van der Rohe's office, 232 East Ohio. So Banham describes this 60s Chicago of Mies and Playboy. In working fact, the two organizations are not nearly as dissimilar as chalk and cheese. Both are run and staffed by craftsmanly professionals with their ambitions pointed at the target zone at the top of the world league. Both have become international standards, yet both retain an unmistakably Chicagoan flavor. The Chicago that became international at the end of the 30s when the great artistic refugees and the pioneer atomic scientists began to arrive in Europe. So it really was this point in time where Chicago, Playboy was a huge influence on Chicago. It really meant Chicago to a lot of people on the international stage in terms of publishing, experimentation in art, illustration, art direction, design, typography. So the Palmolive building here, 919 North Michigan Avenue, after they moved from East Ohio, they really moved up in the world, literally, to the Playboy building as it became known, from 1965 to 1989, when it was home to the magazine. During this time, the word Playboy was spelled out in 9-foot-high letters, and we had this beacon shining from the top of it, really drawing a huge amount of attention to the publication and its efforts. Another indication of its cultural importance at the time, this is from July 1961, a Playboy article on contemporary design in the early 60s, an incredible group photograph depicting mid-century design legends George Nelson, Edward Wormley, Eero Saarinen, Harry Bertoya, Charles Eames, and Jens Riesem. Just incredible, these kind of various photo shoots and snapshots in time that Playboy came to document and represent. So I'm really going to run through very quickly through a number of these covers. What is gradually interesting is that over the years you see the cultural shifts in fashion, in color palette, typography, accoutrements, culture, always with the rabbit present in various forms. Bubbles in the sand. By 1970, the peace sign becomes a rabbit. Right up to the late 70s. So really an equally important part from the covers is the art of Playboy. Art's 4 years at the Institute of Design had connected him to much of the art and design talent in Chicago, and indeed the rest of the world. And right from the start, art, partly through economic constraints, they couldn't afford to commission New York illustrators, but at the same time it became beneficial to them to really, for art with his connection with the Chicago art community, started commissioning people he had studied with, the printmaker Mish Cohn and the photographer Arthur Siegel, former ID instructors of his, right through to increasingly prominent artists, painters and sculptors like Roy Schnackenberg, Ed Paschke, and Seymour Rosofsky. Art, in a very visionary decision, installed a policy at Playboy where the original artworks and illustrations commissioned by him were bought outright. every time, so they could hang the works in the offices of Playboy after they'd served their primary function on the printed page. This allowed both art and the magazine itself as a company to gradually build an incredible, and I would say unprecedented, collection of 20th century art and illustration for the magazine. The works not only enhanced the walls of Playboy offices, but on many occasions the collection was assembled for international exhibitions, shown in museums throughout Europe, Asia, and ultimately even in the States. The collection truly became a comprehensive visualization of the radical evolution of illustration, as well as charting movements in modern and contemporary art during the last half of the 20th century. So here, just again, to quickly run through some examples of this. A Mish Cone illustration for some poems by Carl Sandburg in October 1960, one of Art's favorite teachers at the Institute of Design, as he describes them. Work by Roger Brown. This was after Art had left Playboy, but many of the connections and relationships Art had built between the magazine and the art community really remained. This was a commission of Roger Brown, the American artist and painter, for a sculpture for the opening of Playboy's New Beverly Hills office in '92. And this was one of the works that Roger Brown produced for Playboy, illustrating a work of fiction by Frederick Forsyth in 1978. Leroy Neiman was a particularly prolific artist that Art worked with. Neiman began his association with Playboy in '54, having met Hugh Hefner while doing freelance fashion illustration for Carson Peary Scott, the department store. And Hefner and Art commissioned illustrations for the really early on, right from the 5th edition of Playboy, and he continued to contribute for the next 50 years. Carrick Pope, a Chicago painter who Art ended up hiring as an associate art director, who further helped Art to encourage and bring in many of the artists featured in Playboy. The Chicago artist Tony Fitzpatrick, in particular, in 2002, said this of the influence of Playboy on the art community. "They only hired the best," said Fitzpatrick, mentioning Ed Paschke and Chuck Walker as other local artists that Playboy put in the spotlight. "They were very serious about the art that went into the magazine. When you got the phone call from them early in your career, it meant you were going somewhere. I'll tell you what, it got noticed. Of all the accolades I got into in my career, including a museum show, I probably got more phone calls from people seeing my stuff in Playboy. I don't think I ever worked for a better artistic editor in my life than Carrick Pope." So that was Fitzpatrick in particular, just with his own personal relationship with Carrick Pope, and really indicative of the wider influence that Art had and the types of relationships that he built. Carl Worsam's another great example, the member of the notorious Chicago artistic group, the Hairy Who. And Worsam in particular was another artist who had a really long-lasting relationship, lasting decades with Playboy. Let's see, Ed Paschke was someone else, one of the 14 members of the Imagist movement in Chicago, commissioned many times by Art. This particular work, critical article on Dr. David Rubin, who was most notorious for his famous book, Everything You Wanted to Know About Sex Were Afraid to Ask. And this was illustrating a very critical article that Playboy made on the Doctor, as you can see in Paschke's work. Don Baum, artist, but also renowned curator and champion of Chicago art at the time. Carrick Pope described Baum as the Marcel Duchamp of Chicago. And a key example where Art, Hefner, Baum, and even the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago all crossed paths was Baum's infamous 1969 show, Don Baum Says Chicago Needs Famous Artists. That was the title. And it highlighted Baum's relationship with the Chicago artist community, and that artist community's then relationship with the MCA, and Art's enthusiasm and success in commissioning Chicago artists allowed Art and Hefner to support this exhibition of the MCA's initiative. Hefner actually generously and enthusiastically secured a space for the MCA to run Baum's show, Chicago Needs Famous Artists, and they ended up using a storage building that was regularly used by Playboy to store back issues and handle subscriptions. Just some more artists, Christina Ramberg, another one of the painters associated with the Imagists in the 60s. Roy Schnackenberg, who worked regularly for Playboy. And the fame and level of artists grows in terms of radicality and in terms of notoriety. Salvador Dali in 1974, the renowned Spanish Catalan surrealist painter, set up photos together with the Playboy photographer Pompeo Pazar, titled The Erotic World of Salvador Dali. And then a further project initiated by art where contemporary artists were invited to interpret the famous Playboy playmate. So having mentioned that the standard playmate centerfold was Hefner's domain in the magazine, art had his own particular take on it, this Playmate as Fine Art project, where art basically gave carte blanche, free rein to contemporary artists to interpret the playmates in their own way. He did it initially in the earlier 60s, and it became such a success that when he repeated it here for the 1967 January issue, he was able to bring such prominent artists on board as, again, Dali, as you see here, Andy Warhol, Larry Rivers, Ellen Lanyon, Ben Jonson, George Siegel, Tom Wesselman, and so on. So you can see just some of the spreads, some of the work from that particular article, Tom Wesselman. And perhaps most famously, on an equal level perhaps with Salvador Dali, was Andy Warhol. So Warhol's painting that he contributed to this Playmate as Fine Art story was one of only 3 ultraviolet works that Warhol made in the 60s, where one could only see the painting by viewing it under black light. So as I mentioned, the significant Playboy collection, which was really growing at that time, started touring the world. And this particular photo shows Andy Warhol in conversation with art, here on the right, at an iteration of the Art of Playboy exhibition in Düsseldorf. And I know I'm running late on time here, but I'm just going to have to tell this one story that art relayed to me about Andy Warhol. They apparently, at the opening, as you can see here, they got along so well that the next day when Warhol was scheduled to be interviewed by a local radio station in Düsseldorf, he requested that art join them live on air. So art showed up, and apparently the way that art relays it, Warhol was being a little bit tricky or difficult with the interviewer, only answering in monosyllabic, one-word answers. And so art decided he'd join in too. So out of desperation, when the interviewer turned to art to try and get something a bit more substantial out of the conversation, the first question they went with was, you know, what would you say is a definition of good art? And so art just played along and said, honesty. One word. But for me, that was really a profound answer, and that's something that I see evident in all of this work. Honesty is a key word in terms of an approach to his art direction and to his own art practice. The idea of giving his artists trust and a desire for honesty in those artists, wanting them to be completely personal in their work and to do what they felt was most appropriate. And I guess in the same way you could say that Hugh Hefner himself had given trust to art, for art to make his most honest construction of what an entire work of a magazine should be, through art direction, through illustration, typography, and commissioning. And to that point, art himself, along with these other famous artists and illustrators, he was very fortunate that he himself, as well as being the art director, was a famous artist and illustrator, and would often do works himself to illustrate some of the stories, examples of which you can see here. And I'll just quickly run through some of the other examples of the type of illustration, you know, not just painting or drawings, but often quite experimental materials. This was a neon sculpture, a painting on a barrel by the illustrator Paul Davis. Prehistoric males and females painted onto rocks by George Suiyoka. And Shel Silverstein, who was given a regular column to travel the world and draw his adventures. This was from Shel Silverstein among the hippies in San Francisco. Final part of the story of Playboy before I just get on to the logo itself and finish up with art's contemporary drawings. For me, another radical part, something that I didn't know about myself until relatively recently. Obviously, budgets and magazine production constraints have taken their toll on this type of thing, but participatory graphics was a major part of art's work too, where Hefner would give free rein on the budget for art to devise elaborate die cuts and folds and all manner of tricks with the magazine. Just as an example, first spread, story about the investigation into environmental impact on the development of the Florida Everglades. A crane attending to her nest, the eggs in the nest, upon turning the page, turn into surveyors' helmets. This is one of my favorites, Henry Kissinger, then Secretary of State for the United States. On the first spread, turns from a subject of a stately portrait to an inflated balloon on the following page. And for me, something again that could be created just yesterday in terms of graphic design and typography, a story titled The Code Battle, die-cut holes in a red special inserted paper sheet, selectively isolates letters and then decodes first the opening question and then the story's title and author out of this bank of illegible lettering. Another example on critical article on Social Security. The Social Security card in a man's wallet turns into the filler for a hole in the shoe. And even more elaborate things like asking the readers themselves to take on the role of the art director or the constructor of these intricate die cuts and patterns, Do-It-Yourself Multiple by the artist Ernest Trover in 1970. And walking around Art Studio, you really see a testament to the relationship he had with his artists. Incredible wall when you walk right into his studio that shows just some of the many portraits he was given by the artists and illustrators that he worked with. This is all pictures of art himself. This is a picture of art by Shel Silverstein. So the icon itself was something that I want to just emphasize briefly. The logo was in itself a landmark of 20th century corporate design, let alone just being a minor part, as you saw originally in the very first issue of Playboy, just a little end of article punctuation. But it really became an icon and a symbol of the corporation of Playboy. It made a few appearances. You can barely make out the embossed rabbit here on various anniversary issues. But really in itself, as a piece of 20th century logo design, is really up there with many of the landmark logos of the time. Woolmark logo, for example, from '64, William Golden's CBS logo from the '50s, Paul Rand's IBM, Shemaev and Geismar's PBS logo. They're all on that same level of really icons of 20th century identity design. And as a corporation, it really manifested itself to such levels, including the Playboy jet in the late 60s, early 70s. It reached such iconic status that Paul would regularly receive letters and posts from people where they found themselves spotting the rabbit in the most unlikely situations. This was from a pilot who happened to fly over Mount St. Helena at the time of its eruption. People could spot the rabbit in newspaper clippings, at ancient sites, even in X-rays. And it really just became the symbol that we know today, I think, just almost imperceptible at such a level of ubiquity in popular culture. I mean, artists worked with it, Andy Warhol, of course, Keith Haring, Rosemarie Trockel, making the connection that I made between Woolmark and Playboy. For Rosemarie Trockel, it was kind of a feminist statement, looking at the symbols of domestic to erotic female ideals, from Woolmark to Playboy. It's even appeared on the New Yorker. Even Hello Kitty, just in the last 12 months, this was a collaboration between the Sanrio Corporation and Playboy. I don't know how this happened, but with the hugely respected French fashion store in Paris, Colette. And even on the level of architecture, this was a recent show that took place in the Netherlands, curated by architecture historian Beatriz Colomina from Princeton Architectural School, where they're investigating Playboy's influence in the way that it defined modern architecture and design, an example being that iconic photograph of the mid-century furniture designers that I showed earlier. So I'm aware I'm really running over time here, but I could just go on and on with Paul's work, with Art's work. Art left Playboy in '82, and at the time, Hugh was, loved what Art was doing, was desperate to keep him, and said, "Listen, I'll let you do anything. If you don't want to do the magazine, what else do you want to do?" So as Art left, one of the last things he worked on for Playboy was actually a series of television ads, and this is a photograph from one of the TV shoots. You can see this great Playboy couple there on the left. But what Art continued to do was really mostly return to his artistic practice, but also still work on graphic design commissions. And so there was, through the late 70s, 80s, and 90s. Beautiful series of posters came out of it. This was, again, the face and similar mark making that we recognize all the way back to his childhood for the film festival in '79. Perhaps what I would say is my own personal favorite work of arts, a poster commissioned by the Shoshin Society on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima in 1985. It's a long portrait poster, so when you scan to the bottom of the poster, just in very small lettering, you have this phrase that, as Art tells it, Suzanne, his partner, coined, "War kills the sun." Just a beautiful, very poetic and calm anti-war poster, very powerful. And then use of his own illustrative and artistic works. You'll see some of these in a second as I finish up, but works that he also employed as artworks into his graphic design commissioned work too. So this was a folded poster, an idea that an accordion folded poster could function as a standalone poster that would stand up by itself. More posters for the International Theatre Festival, for the Music Box Theatre here in Chicago, the International Film Festival of Chicago, and since he was also known as I mentioned with the Playboy logo, as an iconic identity designer, Art did work on a number of identity projects as well in his post-Playboy years. One of the most fun stories that Art told me was some people he got to know, students from the Art Institute, ended up starting a hot dog restaurant called Golders. And as Art tells it, they were the best hot dogs in Chicago, and so he designed a logo for them for free, and the payment was in a lifetime supply of hot dogs. But he also worked on proposals for the lyric opera. Imagine if this had been the identity for the lyric. And funnily enough for me, on a personal level, for the MCA here in Chicago. What I think is actually an incredible logo. I would myself propose this for the MCA to use even today. And so to finish up, and this is all too short, it's been a challenge to really fit this in into, I've gone beyond an hour and I'm still only barely scratching the surface of Art's career. But it's important, I think, just to finish up with Art's artwork, work that has continued throughout his life as I've illustrated, and work that still continues very much today. Art is going to be 90 next year, and he still draws to this day. And for me, that's just such an inspiration. The idea that if you do what you love, there's no need to retire. You just keep doing what you love. And so I'm just going to skip through a number of his works. These are from a vast body of work, some of which you saw in the beginning in the photo of his studio, these works of heads, where he's exploring myriad variations of layerings, masks, distortions, mixing the mythical, the metaphorical, the metaphysical. I'm sorry to have to skip through these, but I want to make sure I make it to the end without keeping everyone. Art does a lot of work in kind of more of a linear fashion, linear drawings. Some of these line the hallway of his apartment. And again, some of my personal favorites are these, I guess because I'm a graphic designer and they involve type, this descriptive type or cursive projects that he works on, one of which you saw on that poster just a second ago. So hidden meaning and hidden words in these beautiful cursive abstractions, often working as artworks, sometimes working as commissions. These are just some details. So there's that International Theatre Festival poster. And another commission from a paper company, the Simpson Paper. And this particular one, as I was preparing the lecture, even this morning, I wanted to make sure I could read this out to you all, and I actually called Suzanne, Art's partner, and said, could you remind me, what does this say? I can almost read most of it. It says sort of, once upon a time, in a land far, far away, and then it starts to blur off, and Suzanne reminded me that's exactly Art's intention, and it was really, even this morning, just another profound reminder for myself that that's really what Art's work is all about. It's all open to interpretation. It's always generously giving the viewer a credit for intelligence, and Art's deliberate kind of trailing off of legibility into a kind of more of a poetic illegibility is really the point, the idea that we can complete the statement ourselves and make our own conclusions. Talking sketchbook, I'm just going to read some of these out, and in a way, these last sketches and the statements that Art is making, these are all works that Art works on just in the last few years and to this day, often have notes accompanying them. It's really as if we're looking through his sketchbook and reading his thoughts. And I feel like rather than me fully conclude, I'm just going to read some of these out, and for me they provide a really fitting conclusion. It's the person within that counts. There really was no other place to go. Love is a many-splendid thing. And I love this one. We are all sign painters. I love that. The end of the world. The beginning of the world. Hands that fly. Maybe if the shoe was on the other foot, maybe not. There is so much I don't know that the world seems a strange place to me. Get that robot away from me. It's just such great humor with these works. This one I love. This is a really good comment on contemporary society. 5 men wearing t-shirts with faces on them. Some people are never alone. And then as we move across into Art's most recent work, the work that he's working on to this day, they start to really become more profound. Art's, as I mentioned, he's going to be 90 next year. He's starting to lose his eyesight, and he really is just dealing with it, not letting him stop his drawing, stop his artistic practice. He's just continuing to work with it and really document how things are for him right now, sharing part of that pain, but also just the more contemplative state of where one gets to in old age, go figure the weight of the heavens. In this topsy-turvy way, my body is at peace with itself. And again, always with humor. The last thing I remember, as I recall, I forgot. Did I say that right? Or left? Was anything left out? That's what we're all seeing on these notes here. Many of the drawings are always containing smiles, always the happiness that I am experiencing every time I visit Art up in the 75th floor of the John Hancock Center, where he still has his studio. And for me, this is the perfect ending. A painter's solution. What a man has forever, darkness mixed with darkness to make light. So it's this very last piece of work of art that I think can perhaps provide us with the best conclusion. If I do have to make any kind of conclusion after such a perfect conclusion, I would say that for me, it's a conclusion to an extraordinary body of work that is very much still in progress. This seemingly ephemeral graphic note that we see here from his sketchbook gives us a profoundly honest and very personal message of optimism, generosity, and humor. And all of these attributes, for me, sum up Art in the many guises that he occupies. Artist, designer, art director, and indeed human. Thank you.